South Korea has condemned a defense pact that North Korea signed with Russia earlier this week. The foreign ministry called it a threat to peace and stability on the Korean peninsula. Seoul summoned Russia's ambassador to the foreign ministry to discuss its concerns. While the details of the military pact are still murky, South Korea is worried that it could encourage North Korean aggression. Seoul announced in response that it was considering sending weapons to Ukraine to support its defense against Russia. Journalist Frank Smith joins me now from Seoul for more on this. Frank, Vladimir Putin warned Seoul that supporting Ukraine would be a very big mistake. How is Seoul interpreting that warning?
Well, I think Seoul is still interpreting that warning. One of the articles of this agreement suggested that each country, North Korea and Russia, would come to each other's aid with all means if they were in a state of war. The Korean War ended with an armistice, not a peace treaty. So a state of war arguably exists now on the Korean peninsula. Recently, North Korea, over the past couple of months, has been reinforcing its defensive positions along the DMZ, including crossing the MDL, the military demarcation line inside that heavily mined area. According to South Korean military, North Korean troops died in explosions in that area over the past week, again, reinforcing their positions, including anti-tank barriers. South Korea fired warning shots just yesterday, driving these North Korean soldiers back onto their side of the border. So the interpretation of this is, and the questions that are arising, is this military pact going to embolden Kim Jong-un further? Paresh?
And is this military pact already having an impact on tensions between North and South Korea?
Yes, it is. I mentioned again what's going on along the border. There have also been calls here in South Korea over the past couple of years with North Korea's nuclear and missile developments for South Korea to obtain its own nuclear weapons. And even in the past day, those calls have come from the U.S. that with an American senator suggesting that the U.S. should redeploy nuclear weapons to the Korean peninsula. So there are a number of perhaps unintended consequences that are being felt among the capitals in the region, including South Korea, the U.S. and Japan, as well as even China, that might look upon the agreement between North Korea and Russia with some disdain, but would certainly be increasingly worried with now more talks of nuclear weapons for South Korea. Paresh?
Journalist Frank Smith in Seoul, thanks very much for that.
For more on this, I'm now joined by Dr. John Nilsson-Wright. He's the head of the Japan and Korea program at the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge University. John, Vladimir Putin warned Seoul that supporting Ukraine would be a, quote, very big mistake. How is Seoul interpreting this warning?
Well, I think what the Russian leader is trying to say is that if the South Koreans were minded to provide, for the first time, lethal support to Ukraine, i.e. support in the forms of arms, munitions, to enhance Ukraine's ability to resist Russian aggression, that would be seen as a red line from the Russian perspective. And in all of this, the real critical question is, what does the enhanced security cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang really amount to? You'll recall that North Korea has been seeking to develop its satellite technology capabilities. An abortive satellite launch just a few weeks ago. The sense is that in return for North Korea's provision of munitions and military support to Russia in fighting the war in Ukraine, the Russians might be minded to provide that critical technology. And of course, the language of this new security, this comprehensive strategic agreement between the two countries has alarmed South Korea because they fear that it amounts to something even tantamount to a formal bilateral alliance. That's certainly what the North Koreans are saying. The Russians have been a little bit more circumspect. But if you look at the language of the new agreement, it it creates a commitment on both sides to come to the assistance of their new partner with immediate dispatch very, very quickly in the event of an attack on either one of the signatories.
Well, it's certainly increased tensions on the Korean peninsula, but if we sort of zoom out a bit, how does this Russian-North Korean deal affect geopolitical strategies with players like NATO and China?
Well, I mean, I think from the point of view of the United States, of course, South Korea's most important ally, we've already seen efforts to bolster bilateral cooperation and now more recently trilateral cooperation between the US, Japan and South Korea, joint defense maneuvers, efforts to strengthen deterrence against the threat from North Korea. I think we're some way away from any suggestion that there would be active enhanced cooperation with NATO partners, although that's something that's been happening already, of course. Close coordination between South Korea and NATO. We've had, of course, visits by the South Korean president on the sidelines of the NATO summit. But then again, when it comes to the question of reducing tensions on the peninsula, China, of course, is a critical potential partner. China has no interest in seeing tensions escalate. It worries, of course, that the very existence of a North Korean threat to South Korea will bolster US cooperation with South Korea and Japan. And from China's perspective, given its own concerns and its own ambitions over Taiwan in the South China Seas and in the East China Sea, it wants to reduce the risk that there will be further escalation. So China, in a way, is perhaps the most important player in all of this, and it will be looking potentially to try and restrain Pyongyang, whether it can or not in this context, because, of course, the North Koreans have been looking to reach out to Russia precisely to enhance their own security preparations, is an open question.
So do you get the feeling, it all sounds pretty serious, do you get the feeling that this partnership is destabilizing the whole Asia-Pacific?
We're not there yet, but it certainly doesn't help in terms of ensuring that tensions are kept at a minimum. And of course, we've seen recently with North Korea developing, apparently reinforcing its own defensive facilities at the DMZ. We've seen North Korean troops cross briefly over into the DMZ, which of course has led to a pretty swift response from the South Koreans. That doesn't seem to be a deliberate provocation. It reflects this effort by the North Koreans to bolster their own security on the land border. There is always the risk that conflict might escalate through miscalculation and misperception, not just on land, but in the West Sea, the so-called northern limit line that marks the maritime boundary between the two Koreas. There has long been problems there in that area. And I think it's in light of these new agreements and the more bellicose language coming out of both Moscow and Pyongyang that Seoul and its allies are increasingly concerned.
Dr. John Nilsson-Wright, Associate Professor for East Asian Studies at Cambridge University. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.